Well, hello, everyone. Recently, I got to meet and talk to Erik Dellenback, who is the liaison for Governor Ron DeSantis's Faith and Community Initiative. Florida's done a neat thing, and this role is situated in the executive office. And Erik's job is to be the go-between between the governor and the churches, helping to mobilize the church to reach the most vulnerable, which is part of the state's initiative as well. And they're doing some pretty amazing things in the foster care system, really innovative. You need to listen to this discussion to see what they're doing. I won't spoil it all here. But we also talk about Amendment 4 and why it's a harmful amendment that harms women and limits human flourishing. Erik's an interesting guy with an interesting past. He was a part of college football for many years. Ran the Tim Tebow Foundation, was in part of Chris Tomlin's foundation before he was recruited and signed up for this role with Governor Ron DeSantis. So it was a pretty interesting conversation. So if you're interested in a way to think about the right relationship of the government and church, this conversation's for you. All right. Well, Erik, you have you've made a bold claim. You say out of the 110,000 or so state employees in Florida, you have the best job. That's a pretty radical claim, man. Now, what is it that you do, and why do you feel justified in making a claim like that?
Well, I love it because I think it's probably the most common question I get asked. It's like, so what do you do? Ultimately, what I think the heart of the governor was back in 2019 when he got in was to create a role that allowed the churches and the faith institutions and the nonprofits of Florida to know that they had a voice, they had a seat at his table. And so my role is to get to represent the faith and community institutions of Florida into the executive office of the governor, and the executive office of the governor back to the 20,000 faith institutions and 110,000 nonprofits of Florida. And so in a nutshell, that's what it does. I think I have the best job. So I think I have the best job because I know we may unpack this later, Mike, but it's intriguing to me that government wakes up every day trying to serve the most vulnerable people. And the faith institutions of Florida wake up every day trying to serve the most vulnerable people, but they do it siloed from one another. And so I think that I love it because number one, obviously I get to represent faith. But number two, the work I do actually benefits vulnerable people very deeply. And so it's fulfilling, it's purposeful, and a whole lot of fun. So as
the governor's liaison for faith and community, you speak on his behalf, right? This role is situated in the executive branch or the executive office. Is that right?
That's right. One of the things that I've said to a lot of people as I speak throughout Florida, I said, you should be proud as a Floridian that this role exists. And I'm always quick to say, not because I serve in the role, but rather that their role like this even exists in our state. I give some perspective on that, Mike. Like right now, I think there's about 14, maybe 15 states that have given any faith and community, any position in the governor's administration. Having said that, there's only 2 states, us and recently Arkansas, where the office exists in the executive office of the governor. Truth be told, right, it's much easier if you're going to be involved in faith and you're a politician, it's easier to put it out in an office somewhere or make it a separate nonprofit or a separate agency. It's different when you start to say that faith and community matters at a level that I'm going to put it as close to me as possible. And so, yes, I've been able to speak on really the First Lady and governor's behalf for the past almost 6 years. And, they have been, I don't think anyone in the country right now doesn't know that they're bold. They are very bold. Our governor is very, very bold. And so he has given me just such a tremendous opportunity to be bold about how government feels and appreciates the faith institutions. That was our first thing, by the way. First thing he said is, I want to make sure they know they're thanked. Who says that?
Yeah, right.
I've still not met the other governor that says, as the first priority of this office, go out and thank. And so literally the very first thing we ever did was send out 40,000 thank you notes to the faith institutions and saying, we don't even know how you serve, but we know you're serving vulnerable every single day. And we want you to know that the state couldn't do it without you. Thank you. Amazing.
Wow. So there's a lot of people that are curious about DeSantis. I know there were a lot of people that were hoping he would run They see his boldness, how he's willing to take a stand on issues that many people wouldn't. What's your take? What's your impression of getting to know him and working with him? What kind of man is he?
Honestly, so again, let's be transparent, right? When I got asked to do this role, some people said to me, I had an interesting background in ministry. I bet we'll talk some about it, I'm sure, at some point. But people would say to me, well, did you take the role because, he was popular? And again, I know a lot of people aren't from Florida, but if you were in Florida at that time, he won by less than 1% against a guy named Andrew Gillum. And so the governor, when he first came in, was kind of unknown. He wins at, 50.8% or something like that. And so when I first was asked to do the role, candidly, I had no idea exactly what kind of man or leader he was. The whole state probably didn't know at that time. I tell people unashamedly that I didn't get in it to do politics. I didn't get in it to push a governor. I certainly will never use faith to push for votes. Well, about Amendment 4, I will, but I won't use it for a candidate. And I'll just say like what I've seen in 6 years is one of the most remarkable things. Again, I've had some bosses in the past that are pretty notable. And I have never to this day met someone who is less of a people pleaser. And by being that is just so bold to his principles and to what he believes in that, what we witnessed. I mean, again, maybe the craziest of all was deeming churches essential and telling them they never needed to close during COVID. That was a big deal. And so I can't tell people, I mean, look, I certainly helped all I could with the presidential campaign. My personal hope is that he is eventually president of the United States. I think he's a phenomenally principled man. Watching him and First Lady Casey DeSantis raise a family and have a strong marriage. I mean, it's stuff that I wish people could see what I get to see, because it would change how they feel. Because sometimes his boldness, people have all kinds of opinions about it, but it is off of principle. It is off of constitutional belief. It's been super impressive to me.
So how can people see that? I'm really curious about things like this because, ever since the advent really of television, which changed our form of communication and in terms of politics too, it became about the soundbite. It came about, demonizing your opponent. You don't really do good debate through television. Well, now that we live in the internet age and social media age, it's gotten way worse. I mean, you hear these stories going way back about when Lincoln was running for office, that they would have a 6-hour event where he and his political opponent would spend the evening articulating their positions. Well, radio changed that to some degree. Television radically changed that, amusing ourselves to death. Neil Postman really articulates this well. Then social media age. How can we in this tech age actually get to know our political candidates and someone like DeSantis that you say is the real deal?
Yeah, it's a super difficult question. I mean, look, I don't know how you felt watching the vice presidential debate, but I was watching and I knew as soon as it ended, they would start to say who won, who lost. And man, I was hoping that one of the networks would say the biggest winner of tonight's debate was America. Because we're tired of this, I don't even, again, two men standing on stage saying, hey, he's not a bad guy. We agree fundamentally differently on politics, and here's why we should do that. I don't think that I personally even knew how much I was starving for that, because all of it is so driven by statements of frustration or statements of, I don't like that person. And so I was pleased by where we got to on that vice presidential debate. I thought Governor DeSantis debated Governor Newsom, which was not obviously as big as some of the presidential debates, but it was a phenomenal debate of looking at two different forms of governing a state. And as you know, I mean, over the past, really since COVID, governing a state has changed. I mean, many times it almost feels like it's little nations that you're governing, because now other states, I mean, right now we have thousands of Floridians working up in North Carolina, because there's no more of these days that we only are focused on Florida when we know that we can go up there and help in other environments. So that whole landscape's changing. And watching Newsom and DeSantis debate, and just watching two totally different fundamental beliefs on how you govern a state. And of course, not only am I biased, but the greatest proof of what's working is how many Californians are moving to Florida. And I think that was a healthy debate to see his intellect. He is someone one time told me before I started working with him, they said, he'll be the smartest guy in every room. And he is high intellect. I think the part that's harder for people to see is, and I've seen it a couple times, is when he's in the background playing with the kids on the floor when the first lady is recording a video. Or when I walked in on the day that he was being inaugurated the second time, and he's got the kids playing between his legs. They're throwing footballs in the governor's office. And he's talking to his kids about, hey, tell them, because I'm there with a couple pastors. He's like, tell them what we know about David. Tell them what we know about Samson. What happened with Samson? What gave like that moment, I wish I could show the world, because I'd be like, this is what you need to see. The challenge is that because everything is attack mode, Mike, like people don't want to show behind that curtain, right? They don't want to they want to keep a gap between their personal lives and that world, because they know that really very little is off out of bounds for where people could go. So your question's great. I'm hoping that this vice presidential debate is a starting catalyst for the future.
Well, I saw a number of people making that comment, the comment that was so refreshing to see two men treating each other as human beings, not vermin or some kind of demon that must be destroyed. I'm with you, man. I hope that gives a bit of a vision for what politics can be, where arguments are, you can destroy an argument without destroying a person. And it's like, why have we forgotten that? And we've become lazy in our argumentation, not just in politics, but in almost all spheres where we're arguing for our beliefs. We go for cheap tactics of just trying to demonize another person instead of just attacking their arguments. Now, of course, there are some bad people who also hold bad arguments, but you can just engage the arguments at face value and treat other people with dignity and respect. And I do think a good bit of that was on display in the vice presidential debate. And my hope is that this...
Well, you think about, no, we're just so far apart now, right? Because the difference, what I'm thinking, Mike, and where I think we should have hope, is that the governing theology or practice is so far apart at this stage that you're going to know what works, because there's going to be results. Like they're not so close that you can't determine which one works, which one doesn't.
Yeah,
again,
right.
I'm not using this to pick on California, but that night, if you watch that debate, the debate wasn't, the Governor DeSantis, in my opinion, unraveled Governor Newsom, but a lot of that had to do just with the statistics that Sean Hannity was sticking up on the screen. And eventually, this isn't like a subjective debate anymore, right? We have the statistics to see where crime is, to see where education is, to see where parental choice is, to see where people are moving, that at some point in time, this thing, it doesn't have to be subjective. We can literally state what we believe in and then let the proof show in the pudding.
So how did you end up in this line of work? This is the first time you and I have met. So all I know about you is your bio. But you were in college football for a bit of time. You worked what was your title? Was it the executive director of the Tim Tebow Foundation, or what was your title there?
It was a little bit everything. I was president, CEO, executive director, but got to found it with Timmy.
Yeah, right there from the beginning, and did that for a number of years. A lot of programs, the Night to Shine, which is a prom-like event for children with special needs, which is an issue that's near and dear to me. My oldest son, Aaron, has one of the most rare genetic disorders that exist. So you've been part of helping to produce a movie. Politics, that seems like the natural next step, right? How did you find yourself into this line of work? And why did you stay?
Yeah, I was debating as you're asking that. I'm thinking how deep do I want to go? And I'll try to not go too deep. So I spent 12 years in college football bowl business. Got to start the ACC football championship when the ACC expanded. And when I was just about 30 years old, I was offered a role that at that time would have been the pinnacle of what I wanted my career to be. So all of a sudden, at 30, I'm getting offered this role and a lot of money. And all I had to do was stay put for a few years. And again, I would say to a bunch of people, I hope that are listening to this is where I want to give some testimony. Sometimes when we're given the thing that we think is the most important thing or the point of the world, we realize that thing is not the thing. And so I was offered that role and found myself going, like there better be more than this, because my drive had been really the pursuit of power and money and football and all that stuff. And all of a sudden I was offered the role and felt empty. And again, I'm just going to be real with your listeners today and say that forced me to a real conundrum of like, if it's not this, then what is it? And
you had taken that role, or just when you were thinking about taking the role?
No, thinking about it. Yeah, I had not taken it. Well, all I had to do to take it was stay. It was back. If you remember, like back in those days, the coach in waiting thing was a big deal, where they would hire the next university coach, and they're like, hey, just stay for 3 years and it's yours. And they keep bumping your pay up and all that. So it was one of those kind of programs. And I admired the organization. I admired the guy that was leaving. As a real mentor to me. But something didn't fit. I don't know how to describe it. It was just like being unsettled. And so I had met the Tebow family through some stuff. And so Tim came along right around that same time and asked if I would start his foundation. I said no originally because anyways, there's a lot to that. I was still wrestling with this, like, what is it about? Because going and starting something brand new with an unknown world seemed a bit like, as much as you know is not the thing, it's still scary, I guess would be how.
Yeah, right. Sure.
And so ended up through some prayer and time with my family, I ended up saying yes. We launched the Tebow Foundation in Jacksonville in my guest room back in 2000, late 10. And man, just got to witness. I tell people one of the coolest things of being front seat or front row to like just an amazing ministry blossoming is, one, you get all the coolness of seeing it, but two, you know your own limitations. So you have to give glory to God, because you're like, I know what I'm capable of. And these things like Night to Shine, you bring up Night to Shine. I mean, Tim and I, the whole idea of that was so small in the beginning, and yet God was doing something so much bigger than we knew. And so that's really fun, because a lot of people will give me credit or Tim credit. And because if you're not on the front row, you don't know the limitations of that person. So I did that. And then I left Tim in 2017 only because I traveled. I mean, we were doing a lot of our work in Philippines and Haiti and all over the country. And so I have 5 kids, and I did 200,000 miles on Delta that year, just that one airline. And so it was time to be home. Went home and then got to start Chris Tomlin's foundation. So he's a Christian singer, and his foundation was focused on foster care and adoption. And that intersection was right when the governor was getting elected. And he said, I'd love for faith and community to have a voice at the table. And I'd love to start with trying to get the faith institutions of our state more involved in foster care. And so was offered that role. Man, I've told you 1,000 unknowns. But I felt like, as a native Floridian that loves my state, the idea of what he was describing, never knowing how good it would be, by the way, was enough to give it a chance and see. And all of a sudden I was in politics, and it's a different world.
So how much, it's a weird way to ask this, how much of this was on your radar? And totally unexpected kind of path in life, or would you say this is something you were working towards?
Oh my gosh.
And of course, not being able to predict these certain outcomes. I mean, working with Tomlin and Tebow and DeSantis, I mean, that's not just you set out to do that and then accomplish it, right? This has got to be an element of unknown. So what was it like for you as a younger man, younger family, pursuing this, making decisions? What was it you were working toward versus what you ended up in? If that's a better way to ask that question, maybe.
Man, it's such a great question. There's 2 parts I would just quickly say. One, not one thing planned, not one. I mean, I could have never strategized or planned how God did it. I would tell you what I was working towards once I left the bowl world and realized, oh my gosh, I think there's more to it. Then it became all I could think about was doing things that I could be passionate about and would be on purpose, right? Like kind of that, they would describe the sweet spot of alignment, like your gifts, talents, and abilities where they align with the vocational ministry. And so I just, like, at every stage have tried to prayerfully be obedient and find where God's will is, right? And so, and I'm not, I know people would hear that and be like, well, of course, we all do that. I'm like, yeah, but I've been offered some pretty big roles that I've said no to because they don't align with like my prayers and my family's prayers. And I trust I've got a great praying, discerning wife. And so it's been a path. I've told two, I said, if you summarize my career, I said, there's two things that you need to know. One, I have never, not one time, been qualified for a role that I got offered. Like, it just never happened, not one time. And secondly, there's been this anthem in my life of when you see things you can't unsee, right? So all of a sudden, I think sometimes how God works is he'll show you something, and then you probably sometimes wish you didn't see it, because life is easier to live with blinders on. But once you see it, you realize, this thing's going to change the trajectory of my life. And so the first time that I meet someone like your son and realize there is something different here. It started as an effort to show worth and value to these amazing young people, and really it ended up being far more than young people. But that's where it started. And then you meet, and again, I've never met your son, but I can speak in some generalities. You say you meet some of these amazing children. My guess is very much like Aaron, and you realize they seemingly have a different relationship with God. And you start to think, okay, like, so if one of the things that God's showing me is this incredible relationship where he is almost walking with these amazing young people and adults, and then simultaneously you see the application of worth and value put into someone's life and how that changes everything. Once you get, like, I just feel like God gives you these little nuggets as you go that you can use down the path of pursuing his will.
And so that right there, maybe that helps make even a connection to why you're in the work you're doing and why you find the value in it. Because you'd mentioned earlier about you conceive your role in this liaison role of helping the government work with faith communities to reach and help and serve the most vulnerable. Mm-hmm. Is that kind of what drives you in the work you're doing? And even as you conceive, what is this role as the liaison of the governor to faith and community, that initiative? Is that where it is? It's to help these image bearers who have value and perhaps the most vulnerable amongst them. Is that kind of what drives you in the work that you're doing now? If so, it seems like I can see the continuation here now of the work that you were doing through the Tebow Foundation, almost like a natural step then into a political arena when you're seeking that same aim, when you're pursuing that same aim.
Yeah, I love you. There's so many questions buried in that question, because my focus in this role is exactly what you just described, which is I think that I've been given power and position and authority to serve the most vulnerable by just putting some of the most vulnerable people that government knows about back in front of a group of people who loves the most vulnerable, which is the church, our faith institution. So I've said recently, I think government fundamentally does three things, and I never want to undersell all that government can be, but fundamentally they're involved in money, they're involved in legislation, and then they have a ton of information. And so I've said that I believe deeply that the average church that wants to get involved in foster care, they don't need to go out and find those people. The state of Florida knows all 23,000 children that were in foster care in 2019, and they'd be happy to not give all the information to them, but certainly guide you to them. And so when people are preaching every Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Thursday, like I got services all Wednesday, and they're saying, hey, my heart's broken for this, my mind's broken for this, then why as a state would we not be showing them how to talk to these people? So I think that's an evolution of the role, but the bigger question of what you might be asking, I didn't realize is what you were asking in the last question, is what I feel, if everyone said, what's my calling, right? If someone said, I think we all kind of look for what's our purpose, what's our calling. I would tell you what I believe mine is to mobilize the capital C church, right? So if you wanted to draw a thread in my career, which I feel like you want to do, so I'll just say, like Tebow Foundation, we had 39 different denominations out of the 500 churches doing Night to Shine. We get over to the Chris Tomlin Foundation, and we know there's 423,000 churches or something like that in the U.S. And those 400,000, we don't need to. And now I'm in government, and we've got 20,000 churches in Florida, or 20,000 faith institutions in Florida. So what I learned in my time with Night to Shine and with Chris, and now here in the state of Florida, is that the capital C church is the greatest infrastructure of aligned theology and aligned hearts in the world, right? But we don't often get along, and we very often don't work together on things. And I think that one of the things God showed me that seems to be the secret sauce for that is honestly because we talk about too many topics. And what I mean by that is, and this was Timmy and I back in Night to Shine, if we talk about loving God and loving people, we don't have any fundamental disagreements. If we start talking about any other topic of theology, you and I probably in about 3 or 4 topics could disagree on something. And so I think what I've been trying to do for the past now about 14 years is help the capital C church see things they can't unsee, which is that's my anthem, and have access to be able to solve some of those things, which their heart beats for anyways. And so I would add, because I know we're going to do Amendment 4, something that I just find interesting about God's path in this. I know this is going to be a very, very tough statement for you to hear, because but with the overturn of Roe v. Wade, there'll be the most aborted group in the world is people with special needs, right? In the world. And the second would be low income situations, right? And so it doesn't surprise me that God would have my two last roles be one, serving people with special needs, and two, serving foster care, because these will be, statistically speaking, the two areas where more babies will be born in those situations than in the past 50 years, right? And so to say to the churches, and again, I have a unique role when I walk in. I'm in a little church right now in Pensacola. I'm doing a speech tomorrow morning here, and I'll say to them, guys, it can't stop with killing legislation. We have got to be prepared for these mamas and babies and daddies that are going to be new, and they're going to have new challenges, and they're going to have new things. And we as our faith institutions can't stop at just killing legislation. We've got to be, as many pastors are now saying, pro-life, womb to tomb. And so I think, Mike, I want to be careful to say none of those things were my strategy. But if you ask me where I think God's been taking these roles, that's probably the thread.
Well, I think it's inspiring and hopeful to learn that there are people like you in politics that are not driven, at least it seems. Now, again, I've known you for 20 minutes. You certainly can be fooling me here. But you at least seem to, you strike me as someone who's telling the truth, and someone who is not driven by selfish, prideful ambition or greed, but you're driven out of love for your neighbor and for the most vulnerable among us. And one of the most pressing issues of our time is, what does it mean to be human? What makes us valuable in the first place? And we've lost an understanding of that. Christianity gave the West a gift through a concept of like the Imago Dei that says all human beings are equally valuable because they possess the same value-giving property, their human nature. Well, we've forgotten that. And the implications of that, whether it comes to special needs or an issue like abortion that we'll get to, are paramount. And so to know that there are people in government that are driven out of compassion and a love for their neighbor, the most vulnerable among us, is an inspiring and a hope-giving thing to hear and learn. So,
well, let me extra encourage you. I have an amazing team in the Governor's Faith and Community Initiative of people that God has handplucked from all over state government and put a call on their heart to come serve in a different capacity. But equally as cool as that, we started a Bible study here in the state back 4 years ago or so, and just said, hey, this is just for high-level state leaders that have ever served in Florida as a pretty high-level leaders, and we're going to study what Scripture says about government. And so for instance, if you were to read about King Herod makes a decision, we're not analyzing it just from how it reads in Scripture, but we'd be like, where were his advisors during this? What would, if you were asked to do what he asked them to do, how would you feel? So it's a very real look at what it looks like to be a faith leader. And I will tell you, I think there's 26 members or so in that study now. It would blow Floridians away. It's almost every ranking person in Florida state government. And so I just think we're in a really unique and interesting special time where the leaders of our state, and I can't speak to all the states, that God has done some very, very particular appointing for a season such as this.
So I say inspiring and hope-giving. There's probably even a lot of Christians that go, this is not appropriate. Faith and politics should be as far apart as possible. We should not be worrying about any earthly kingdoms. What's of ultimate value is a heavenly kingdom. So what have you encountered pushback personally, even in the role that you're pursuing? And how do you respond to that? Maybe even just offering a bit of a theology of politics here. Should the state and church be separated? Is that even how our country was set up? And regardless of that, what is the biblical outlook or the biblical view of politics and the relationship of Christians to their government?
Most common question I've ever been asked in this role. Some people will be as bold to say, isn't the nature of your role or the existence of your role a violation of the separation of church and state? And so I don't know. I mean, literally hundreds of speeches I've given where I don't let anyone off the hook. I actually walk through that. So I'll just say that I don't, because I've learned that the average person that says that to you, number one, isn't looking for dialogue, which is a bit of a bummer anyways, because I'd like to dialogue on it. But two, they're also usually, and I don't mean this harshly, but they're usually not educated on what the separation of church and state means in the United States of America. I just did an interview last week with the Canadian Broadcast Network, which was interesting in it. So that's a whole that's another podcast. But I would say, we start getting into what they said to me, what does it mean for the U.S. separation of church and state? Because they've heard it. Everyone's heard it. And so what you need to understand is that what Thomas Jefferson meant in the letter that he wrote, not the Constitution, is an imperative principle. Two, actually. One imperative principle is that there'd be no such thing as a national church. And two, that government stay out of the business of the church. Mike, I think the reason Florida has seen ridiculous success with my role now is because the great issue was that it had nothing to do with what Thomas Jefferson wrote. It was the misinterpretation, the misuse of that phrase that caused the siloing of faith from government, right? If you look at the national history, faith is at the very epicenter of serving the community. Somewhere along the way, faith abdicates that role to government. The problem is that when faith gave that role up, they still were attending services and they were hearing things like Matthew 25 and James 1:27. And they're like, oh, wait a minute. Like my heart's still beating. I'm still like, my heart's breaking for this thing because it breaks God's, but I think I gave it over to government. So they come back in, right? So they come back in. It's all during this separation of church and state time. And then for some reason, they become very, very worried about it. So they silo out, right? And I have said, and I'll say this every time someone asks me, I believe that both government and the faith institutions of our state are not as fully effective and efficient as they could be without the other when it comes to serving vulnerable people. So that's not argued. I mean, no church would argue that because they'd be like, well, of course, the government needs us. But I just would say to all of them, what I've learned in almost 6 years in this role is, you need government too, because again, I go back to what is the connection point that needs to happen? Well, one way to say that, and maybe this is the fastest way to say it, is as Christians, we don't talk about a resource issue, right? Because we know we have a God with cattle on 1,000 hills, so we don't have a resource issue. But I would say neither does Florida. Florida has 16.9 million people say they're faith-based in Florida. That's wild. So we don't have a resource issue, but we have a massive connectivity issue. And so one of the things I think that government can do, and really the First Lady has been a champion of this as well, is government can, again, can I paint a picture, Mike, of what I'm talking about? Just
do it, man.
So there's something we're using in our state called Care Portal right now. So we found out that of the children removed from our homes to go into foster care. Okay, now this again, I'm going to give you something you will not be able to unsee. Of the kids removed, 20% were abuse, 80% were neglect. Okay. So here's what that means. It means that 20% of the kids we got to remove because we're going to keep kids safe. That's our fundamental purpose. 80%, you start to ask the question, well, what's neglect? Right? Well, we find out, and I got goosebumps saying this to you because I just feel like telling you it's going to stick with you and you're going to use it. And I hope you do. The number one tangible need that children were being removed from homes for was a lack of beds. Okay. Now I would ask you, a lack of beds is the number one tangible need. Now you got mental health and you got, I'm talking about physical needs because the state code says there has to be a bed per child. So you got this image of like, okay, this caseworker, CPI is standing in a home, they're writing their report. They're on this decision of like, am I going to remove a kid for a bed? And so I think that these underpaid caseworkers and CPIs probably went and bought a bed on the first one. And I said on the second one, I think they probably called Uncle Johnny and said, Uncle Johnny, I need you to buy a bed because I'm not going to remove this kid because the family's okay. There's a lot of issues in the house, but I'm not going to remove this kid. And so what's happening in Florida, this is that we're using something called Care Portal. It's a technology app. It came out of Kansas City. We were the 29th state to have it, so we weren't pioneering anything. But Florida is blowing it out of the water. And all it is that that caseworker now can enter in and say, they can't say the family's name. So family in Pensacola needs bed. And when they hit submit, it goes to every church and nonprofit in that area that has signed up. Now, what I'm saying there is that can't you imagine, like we sit under these pastors that are like all day long preaching this stuff, but more often than not, we have to forget about it by Monday because we don't know how to do it. Like,
right.
Like, be involved in foster care. It's like, well, I don't know what that means. And so, how? So just to give you some stats so there's 850 churches right now out of the 20,000 that have signed up for Care Portal. They all should, by the way. They haven't yet, but they all will eventually. And secondly, all 67 counties have need meters happening. Do you know what's happening? Mike, I wish this was hanging off the side of our Capitol. But do you know that since 2019 to today, in 2019, when I started this role, we had 23,332 children in foster care, 23332, which is a number you don't round, right? That's 23,332 kids. You know that 5 years later to the day, 5 years later, we just did the report a few months ago, we were at 16,959. We've had almost a 6,000 child reduction. And the reason they've been reduced is because we now have faith institutions going upstream from the so this is where I want to answer your question. This is the big one, which is every state should be paying attention to their faith. Every state. In fact, I'd say the 14 that are doing it are not only trend setting, but think of if the faith institutions of our state are willing to spend their money, their time, their effort upstream from foster care. So 3 things happen. 1, the child obviously gets the resource taken care of. 2, the person at the church has their heart fulfilled because that's what they felt like they were supposed to do anyways. And then ultimately 3, that child avoids the most traumatic day of their life, which is their removal. So I would say to the 36 other states, what are y'all thinking? Like, even if you only had a faith and community initiative to say thank you to the churches for the work they do that saves taxpayer dollars, it would be worth it. I mean, the amount of work that 20,000 churches do on a daily basis, standing in the gap for the most vulnerable, makes it justifiable that every single state should be thanking them continuously for giving out clothes and for giving out food. Because if the church ever disappeared, the state infrastructure would implode immediately. And so I just would argue the other side.
Yeah, that's brilliant. That is a great program there, and word needs to get out about it, because you're right. The people that sit in the pews, they are very generous, both with their time and their money. And the problem is they often just don't know what to do. And that would include pastors. And pastors get they get bad rap on a number of things, but pastors they're overworked. They aren't paid great. Now, some of them are, but not, a lot of them are not overpaid by any stretch of the imagination. And, they're dealing with all kinds of problems. They're dealing with pastoral care issues. They're dealing with organizational issues. Oh, and you have to be a world-class public speaker every week on a different topic every week. So then when you get confronted with something like foster care and you're burdened by it, many pastors are in the same boat. Like, I don't know what to do. Man, learning about that, we can help by simply providing a bed for a kid in need. And I can do this through my government. What a brilliant solution to a really important problem. And nice work, man. More people need to know about this.
Well, I think, Mike, I think a lot of pastors probably are terrified of, again, this can be very real to you, and I don't want to keep going there, but I know you've probably lived this. 2 of the hardest ministries to do in a church are special needs and foster care, because they're hard. I mean, that's it's hard to be a parent. It's hard to be a church that supports those ministries. And yet what Night to Shine did, so I'm on vacation actually years ago, and a pastor comes up to me and he pokes his finger into my chest and he's like, you know what I hate about Night to Shine? Which I'd never heard. So I was super intrigued. And he said, I hate that you put hundreds of kids on our doorstep on Friday night and I don't have anything for them on the Sunday. And I said, well, you don't, and he was obviously being somewhat sarcastic, but I was like, obviously he doesn't hate Night to Shine. God is doing something. See, so sometimes this is my whole point about, I think part of my role, I think a lot of our roles, I think probably very much this podcast, is to help people see things they can't unsee. And then the Holy Spirit takes over and does that work. And so as I look at that, so here's a crazy statistic I just was given a while back was almost 80% of people who enter a need on Care Portal, right, never enter a second need. And so, anyone who's ever dealt with people in need, it's not because they don't have more needs. It's because the moment a church shows up to bring a bed, but they see that the roof has a hole and the floor has a hole and the food conditions aren't good, they're no longer a state family. They're a church family. And so, this again, I think, I don't want to wear this phrase out, but I just believe what, again, you're seeing happen is someone seeing something they can't unsee. It matches what they were hardwired to know. Oh, this is what I should do. And I think so many pastors had been terrified to step into foster care because they felt like if I talk about foster care, then I need to foster. I mean, that's just real talk, right? It's like, that's, right. And I think the fact that we're now saying to them, no, like God didn't say every person has to be a foster parent, but he also said every person should care about these kids, right? And so giving them a host of different ways they can be involved actually allows an output of the heart of the pastor. And if there's an output of the heart of the pastor, then the pastor can speak about it. And so we're watching all that kind of matriculate that was the same thing that happened with Night to Shine was, the average person that comes up on someone with special needs, I used to just, talk to a lot of parents and I'd say, look, I don't think the average person is judging. It feels like judgment when people stare at your kid. But I was like, I don't think it's judgment. I think they're a little bit terrified. They're ignorant in some ways. And I think just like slowly allowing them to see these moments of reality of worth and value, see these moments of people in need. Again, I trust that God takes care of the rest.
Yeah, pastors can do a lot of good just by bringing awareness and speaking about these issues.
Yeah.
When it comes to special needs, I know what you're saying. I mean, I live it, and families with children with special needs, they experience this a lot. It's the I see you, but I don't see you kind of thing. Yep. It's the I want to stare, but I feel wrong for staring. Mm-hmm. And I want to ask a question, but I think that whatever I'm going to ask you is going to be offensive. Mm-hmm. And so that's the kind of arm, the stiff arm that families with special needs get. But this is where pastors can help. It's just by bringing awareness to these issues. And once it becomes it becomes more familiar to the congregation, the church, again, it's filled with generous people that they just need help seeing things that they can't unsee. I really like that. And
that was a small little woman in Haiti said that to me, Mike. First time I ever went to Haiti. She said, Eric, you're going to see things today you'll never unsee. And boy, she was right. But not just in Haiti, just everywhere.
Okay, so with all of the good that maybe people can, they're catching this conversation, they're going, wow, I can see this relationship between the government and church and how we can care for a lot of needs. Why take on abortion? Because it seems like the controversy of something like that could blow this whole thing up, where you have people now saying, see, this is why church and state should stay apart. The government shouldn't have anything to do with abortion. Even Kamala is saying that, you don't have to check your faith. You can be involved in, whatever your faith is. You can still be pro, you can be in favor of the government, not, dictating to women what they should do with their bodies. And this is where people are going to say, see, I can't do politics and Christianity, or I can't do my faith in politics anymore. This is just too much. So with all of the good that your role can achieve, why are you guys taking on the issue of abortion? Couldn't it derail the whole thing?
I'm going to answer this simply, and I'm going to try not to tear up. The reason we're taking it on is because the difference of where we sit as a state today, as what we call a heartbeat bill state, and where this amendment would take us is 40,000 babies per year in the state of Florida. That's it. That's the why. I mean, people can say it also would make Florida a tourism abortion destination state, which I just can't even get my mind around those words. But my why is 40,000 babies a year. And honestly, again, I'm gonna skip just breaking down on your show, Mike, but I have a vision that God, not a vision, but God, I was standing somewhere at a concert with about 40,000 people at that concert. And in that moment, I saw that as babies, and I was like, holy cow, that's per year in our state. And so the reason we're talking about it is because this is a massive, massive quantity of people that we're fighting for. I think Amendment 4 made it particularly easy to talk about because I think they went so extreme that, I've shared, I think probably a lot more like a preacher sometimes than I do like a government person. So I see the challenges. I mean, we're coming off of COVID, which might have been the most divisive time in a pastor's life, trying to talk to his congregation, and immediately there's 50% of the room disagrees with them. And, again, I think they're probably, the topic of abortion may have that feel to it, but this amendment doesn't. I mean, this amendment, by removing parental consent, by taking abortion, to full term or past the point when science has proven a baby can feel pain, like these are things that they went so extreme, it made it easier. If you can follow what I'm saying there, it's like, and I feel like, I think I would say this. There's a pastor in Jacksonville that I really admire that recently stood on stage and he said, "I know that a lot of you don't want me to get political, but in this case, politics got theological and stepped into God's kingdom, and I have to talk about it." And I think, like, I have not spent my time, almost 6 years, I've not pitched one thing that's political, not one thing until now. And again, I'm trying to tell a bunch of pastors this was theological far before it was political. And I think it's an interesting thing that somehow we've been convinced, particularly as faith leaders, that this is a political issue. I'd be like, no, this issue has deep roots in Scripture. This Imago Dei thing that you're referring to makes it where, to me, and again, I also think, I don't know, I don't want to oversimplify it, but I still haven't been in a room where you could say, hey, who in here is for removing parental rights? And what I mean by that, in case people haven't heard, this amendment would make the only medical procedure a minor could undergo without parental consent abortion. Now, again, 5 kids, I can't approve a Tylenol. I mean, they can't give my kids Tylenol in elementary school without me approving it. And yet abortion would become non-parental consent. So I look at a bunch of pastors right now and I say, guys, number one, I think there's a lot of political issues. And this, I hope this is okay. I think Amendment 3 should be a no also. It's the marijuana amendment. But I don't spend my days walking around telling pastors they should talk about Amendment 3, right? Because Amendment 3 is a very different issue than the issue of life. And so I'm very careful not to combine things. I don't go down those paths because, again, I think I'm not trying to get them to be political. I'm actually just trying to get them to tell their congregation what Scripture says about these things. Because our society, so this guy that did that has a very, very big church. I think they have like a 20-something thousand membership. And he told me he said that, and then he walked through Amendment 4 and received 150 plus emails after that sermon, and every one of them was positive. And the message to him was, thank you, Pastor, for saying, like, if your pastor is not going to tell you the truth, who is? Right. Like, if your pastor is not going to tell you what Scripture says, who is? And so I'm coming from the angle of, guys, look, I got to stand next to Timmy, I got to stand next to Chris, and Timmy would say there are just certain moments we can't stay silent, right? And I think, like, I'm just using any leverage, any platform, any pass that I've got to really tell pastors, and I'm not saying this to be cute, I want on November 6th, which is the day after the election, I don't want any pastor to be able to say, I didn't preach it because I didn't know, right? If they didn't preach it, they didn't preach it. That's a whole nother thing. But if they didn't preach it because they didn't know, it's my fault. And so we're in the middle of I think I've done 50 speeches around the state. We're gathering continuously. I'm doing Zoom calls with pastors every Thursday, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. It's been amazing. And I just want to make sure that they don't wake up on November 6th filled with regret, because I feel like if this thing passes, because a constitutional amendment, I mean, again, I know most people don't know, right? They think it's a statute. They think it's a law. They think a governor or a legislature can change it. No, only one amendment in the history of Florida, which this one will not do, ever has come off the Constitution. So I try to tell people, I said, whatever happens on November 5th, we will live with till the day we die, right? So this is not something that's like we just legislate around it. And so I think of myself. Right.
And so for people for people that aren't tracking and are aware of what's going on in Florida and 10 other states or so across the country, that there's a proposed amendment to the state's constitution on the ballot this November that, if passed, will enshrine basically unrestricted abortion. It'll take away parental consent. It has vague language that doesn't clarify things like viability or health, life of the mother. it will be enshrined into the Florida state constitution. And so to your point, you don't want any pastor on November 6th saying, oh, I didn't know, otherwise I would have said something. I think pastors have to have that same mentality for their people. I don't think pastors should, they do not want the weight that will come from their people saying to him, why didn't you tell us about this? Why didn't you tell us? If there is one place people should expect to hear reasoned moral guidance on important issues, should it not be the church? And you make reference to not crying. I'll be careful not to get too carried away here. I was a pastor for 11 years before the role that I'm in now, and I know every reason why pastors don't want to talk about abortion, but I also know the moral culpability that I would have if I didn't. There are so many people in the church that have had past experience with abortion, and they don't feel like they can talk about it because their pastor never talks about it. So they live in a closet of shame their entire life because a silent pulpit says to them, this is just too messy. Keep it to yourself. So pastors need to open up and talk about it, if for no other reason than to invite people into their churches to open up and talk about it. But also they need to, if they're not going to hear a biblical, well-argued position on abortion, where else are they going to hear it? They're not going to hear it anywhere else, much less the fact that you can win on this. To your point, saying that pastor got 150 positive responses. I love telling this one particular story from when I was pastoring and was going to preach on abortion. I was going to be biblically grounded. It was going to use science and philosophy. And I was going to show images, not of the abortion procedure, but of the aftermath. Because like you had said, once there are some things that you can't unsee, and on an issue as important as abortion, you need to see it and know what it is. Well, anyways, I'm getting ready to preach. And right before the service starts, a friend of mine comes up and says, you're not going to believe this, but one of my friends from college is here. He's never been to church his entire life. He's an atheist, but I convinced him to come today. Don't mess this up, which is exactly what you want to hear before you're getting ready to preach. So I think, well, do I need to preach a different sermon? And I like, no, I'm going to preach the sermon I thought I was going to preach. Well, after the fact, he's the first person coming up to me, and he's got his hand outstretched and he says, Mike, I had a culture shock experience this morning. You see, where I come from, and he was from Spain. He said, nobody talks about this. And when they do, they certainly don't talk about it like this. And what I heard this morning was not judgmental. It was thought provoking. It used science and philosophy. And he said, I could not believe this was coming out of the mouth of a Christian. I'll never be the same. See, he had written off Christians as people that just wasted their time with silly, irrelevant myths and fairy tales and had nothing important to say about important issues. Well, him hearing that changed his mind on who Christians were, which opened up his mind to the gospel. But here's my point. This is an issue that pastors can win on, and their people need to be informed. And if the church is not going to speak on this, who else is going to?
So I'm sorry I jumped in so fast on that amendment, because what you just described is exactly right. And I have said, I think the anthem of this amendment comes out of Hosea 4:6. My people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge. So to give a national scale on this thing, right? 7 states have seen an abortion amendment come in front of their voters since the overturn of Roe v. Wade. All 7 states passed that amendment, enshrining some form of late-term abortion into their constitution. There's 10 more up right now. Florida is probably leading in one of the most extreme that's been allowed on the ballot. Interestingly, we have a 60% rule, so it does take 60% of our vote. But I'm telling you that, like, these people that write these things are brilliant, right? Now, they're not brilliant on the side that I'd like them to be on, but I mean, we know that $15 million was spent in Florida to write this amendment and get the petitions. $15 million. All the money was from ACLU, Planned Parenthood, and Open Society from Soros. So you got to start asking, why is $15 million of out-of-state money coming in? Why are they getting 1 million petitions? And by the way, we did the math on it just for fun. It was $449,000 per word, because it's a very, very brief amendment. It's very ambiguous. And this is the play they're running in 17 states now. And they realize that doing that by putting some tricky, deceptive language in front of voters. Look, I've been there. I've been in the voter box and looked, and all of a sudden I get down to something. I'm like, do I
don't know what this is.
Am I against that?
Right.
It's intentionally done that way. And so we've learned in these other states that education is the key, right? We have to have people walk into a voter ballot box informed, educated on what the topic is. So this pastor piece, two things about that. I'm thrilled to hear that you were a pastor for 11 years, and I join you in echoing that I don't think there's a harder role on the planet. Like I don't know a role that requires more out of a person than being a pastor. Like, because you're supposed to be 20 things at one time, and so please know that as the groundwork of how I believe. At the same point in time, someone asked me the other day, an angry Marine came up to me, and he said, "How can pastors not be talking about this?" And he was fired up, and I said, with all due respect to everything that's required of that role, I actually think it comes back to what the pastor believes their ultimate accountability is. And again, this is not, it's like, so for instance, and there's a culture that says your ultimate accountability is attendance and tithing and budgets and like, and being tolerant or being in the middle and I just think like, again, I have to trust that each of those people is in deep prayer and discernment about that. But for me, when I'm standing in front of the ultimate judgment, I want to be like, I laid it out for Amendment 4 because 40,000 babies per year were at risk. And that's 40,000 little image bearers, 40,000 little Floridians. It simultaneously motivates me to say we better be ready for those 40,000 babies. But one of the things you started hinting at, a bunch of churches are nervous because the IRS has this thing called the Johnson Amendment from 1954 that says like, you're not supposed to push political candidates. And so they're like, well, how am I allowed to talk about Amendment 4? Well, first off, no church ever has lost their 501c3 status for anything in that regard. But as it relates to issues, it's all based on a percentage, and it's too long of a thing to delve into. But if people actually researched it, they would find that the average church could probably spend 20 to 30 minutes or more every week, every single week, talking about political issues, and they would never, ever, ever be at risk, right? So one of the guys, some really smart lawyer that I got to travel with and speak with for a while, the head of the Liberty Council, said, Eric, it's not a reason that they can't talk. It could only be an excuse. And again, if anyone says I'm not going to talk about it because of ramifications of IRS, I would love to talk with them and unpack how unreasonable that is. That's just a fear thing that has been done intentionally to muzzle a lot of our faith.
Yeah, it's a fear thing that could be eradicated through a 5-minute Google search. Correct. When we as an organization were deciding on whether or not to weigh into this issue. And when I say whether or not, it was really how to do that. That was one of the questions we had to make sure we had an answer to, which was, will this jeopardize our tax exempt status? And it won't. It's very clear, and it's very easy to find out that what we are doing, because we've created a series of videos that raise awareness on the issue of Amendment 4 and doing it from a biblical and an apologetic standpoint. We actually just had one made with Tony Dungy that was released last week. And so what we're doing is lobbying, and there's no way around it. But the law is clear, and because of the amount of time we are spending on this and the amount of money that we are spending on this in proportion to the rest of our work, there's no chance of us losing our tax exempt status. And the same is true for churches, and pastors just need to know this, get past that fear, and just do a quick Google search so that they can be involved in bringing awareness to this issue.
I think Christians got caught flat-footed in the overturn of Roe. I mean, just honestly, I think we prayed about it for 50 years, but I don't know how many people, myself included, by the way, like I just don't know that we were ready. Like, and
there was no strategy for the day after. You're right about that.
And the opposition strategized much faster. We looked at it and we're like, we won. Like we did something great. And by the time we're saying we did something great, the other side of this issue has already started formulating, already started putting, and all of a sudden 7 states woke up. They walk into a ballot box and they enshrine in their state constitution something that I don't think if they had thought through or been educated on would have happened. There's 2 stats that blow my mind. One is these stats you read that 30% of people sitting in the pews of our church still aren't registered to vote. That's crazy to me because I'm an Army family. Everybody has served in the Army. And so I don't, way too many men and women have died for us not to exercise that right. But secondly, I'm always surprised by why people think they need to check their faith vote at the door when it's like, no, the faith can drive. Someone the other day was given the examples of Wilberforce and Bonhoeffer and MLK. It's just these, like, literally faith drove everything about what they did to change the landscape of the political world. It is a lie. It is a straight lie to say that you can't talk about it, shouldn't talk about it. That's just a tactic from the enemy to muzzle the people that should be voting aligned with their scripture. So anyways, yes, I'm thrilled you're doing it. And I did see the Tony Dungy one. That was awesome. And I felt like your guests are really coming down since I'm the next one right after that. I feel like so someone told me, like, hey, you're going after Tony Dungy. And I said, it feels like I'm like the campus pastor that gets up after this great sermon. It's like, have a few other things to say, So anyways, but I did see it. It was awesome.
That seems to be a pretty humble view of yourself for someone that has worked with the kinds of people that you have and are doing the kind of work that you're doing. So maybe let's bring a little bit of clarity here at the end for those that are listening about this. So if you're looking at this from a biblical standpoint, is getting involved in politics the same thing as forcing your religion on somebody else? Could you speak to that person maybe that's having that conflict? Like, okay, I get it, but I don't think I should force my religious views on other people. And maybe that's why they're staying out of politics, whether it's the pastor or the person that's not going to vote, right? What would you say to that person to ease their conscience or to guide them in the right way?
Well, but my problem, Mike, is that even that's misdefined, right? So I would say to the average person, look, again, I go back to Hosea 4:6, which is people need to be educated and informed. In our case, now Florida, again, I think we were given a gift because we're dealing with a bad amendment. I mean, that's the gift of that is it's so deceptive and it's got so many flaws in parental consent that in Florida's case, I think it's simply just help people understand what they're looking at when they walk in the voter ballot box. And I think we'll win. I mean, I think it's just literally about a grassroots campaign to get as many people as possible to know what they're reading. The second part of what you're talking about there, I mean, see, my problem is that the reason that we bring our beliefs in Christianity to other people is because we have experienced them to be a source of peace, joy, and hope, right? So like, I always get a kick out of the fact that people are like, I don't want to push I'm like, well, that's certainly like and look, I've watched a lot of Christians do it very poorly. So I think that's the problem that's the image. That's unfortunately that guy that you met from Spain. He's probably had some pretty poor experiences about this, like, and abortion, by the way, and pro-life brings out all types of people. I mean, some very aggressive people that have 50 years of aggression and messaging that they want to just push and punch. And it's like, so I'm not for that because I don't think that's effective. But to say, would you consider that scripture does speak into life? I mean, I don't think there's a person, one of the things we've been talking about as a state, there is a number for every person as to when they think it's too late. Every person, right? And so it's just like, okay, so we as churches, as faith institutions, as government need to be talking about, where is it? Like, where is that line? And I think that's been like, you watch it, everybody's dancing around. I think one of the great strategies, if we'll put it under that category, that the pro-choice movement did was get a bunch of people that were in the pro-life movement all becoming viability experts, right? So like, that's why you hear people now say, well, I'm pro-life at 0 weeks and I'm pro-life at 6 weeks and I'm pro-life at 15 weeks. I've not heard someone say they're pro-life at 24 weeks, but I think someone might believe that because they're like, I have become a viability expert as to when. And so I think like, I've told a bunch of pastors that have been like, what do you want me to preach about it? I'm like, I want you just to preach scripture. I want you to talk about what the Lord said about life because, as a Christian, I don't think Jesus was ever shy about exposing what he believed was the truth, or not believed, what he knew was the truth, and how that is good for you, right? That's the part that I think that we keep missing is it's like, if I look at my friend, I'm not trying to pummel them with something. I want them to experience peace and joy and freedom and understand the value of life. But there's no beating in this thing. It's got to be a gesture of love and education. And I'm telling you this is what I've experienced traveling the state now. There are two churches that I see growing at a rapid rate, right? This one in Jacksonville I was referring to 12 years old, over 22,000 members now, and is a expository Bible preaching, don't miss a verse, don't skip a theme, don't back away, talk about it, right? Those churches are growing, undeniably growing. The other one that's probably growing are the ones that are either preaching false teachings or just soft vanilla teachings, right? And so my comment is that, and that's unfortunate, but to all the ones that are like, I don't want to be bold, I'd be like, look around. Like again, I think I personally come into that building, not to just be encouraged, but to be told what the truth is, to learn about what that book says, and to have a guidance of how that should make my actions change. And so I don't know. I think there's, someone asked me, and maybe this is where I'll end on that, is that somebody asked me the other day, they said, Eric, do you have an opinion of what you think God may be doing with Amendment 4 that's not the government piece? And I said, I do. I see two things that I think we should be blessed by in Florida. One is that every denomination right now in our state is talking, right? So like I've got a call coming up on Thursday with one of the larger non-denominational churches talking with Bishop Paulmeyer from the Diocese of St. Augustine. And we're talking about, again, going back to, let's talk about the things we agree on, not the things we don't. And Amendment 4 has brought about a reunifying of the body in a way that I have rarely seen. It's really a neat thing, because honestly, the Catholics and Protestants, of all the things they disagree on, this is not one of them. In fact, Catholics many times have run circles around the Protestants on their focus on being pro-life. And so that's one. Yep. Two is I feel like COVID and now Amendment 4 in Florida are arming these pastors to be bolder than they've ever been, to speak, and yet in that boldness find freedom. And so those are the two things I look at and I think maybe there's more coming.
Yeah, well, this is a great opportunity here. And for those that are wrestling with this, I don't want to impose my religious beliefs on other people. No, conceive of this opportunity as a gift. The kind of government we have, a representative democracy, you have the ability to seek the good of your neighbor by arguing for your beliefs, not literally forcing them on somebody. And it is a great gift. And so when it comes to Amendment 4, it is bad law. It will harm human flourishing. It will harm your neighbors. You need to register to vote, and you need to go vote no on this. And it's a very practical way for you to seek the well-being of your neighbor and to love them as you would love yourself. Eric, I'm glad you're doing this work, my friend, and bringing some awareness to this issue, but also creating pathways for the church to practically get involved in loving their neighbors. I think this is a beautiful vision. And in many ways, this is hope-giving for me and for hopefully others that hear this, that conceive of this kind of relationship that the church and government can have. Maybe one last thing to end on here is one of the things that I think we're up against is storytelling, and that the pro-abortion side, they do really well at telling stories. Now, not all of them are honest. Many of them are deceitful. Like at the DNC, they had several testimonies of people who were having miscarriages and said they were denied appropriate care because of pro-life law. And there was something very dishonest about each of those stories. Even so, the stories themselves were powerful. And it seems to me that the pro-life side doesn't do such a good job in storytelling. We talked about strategy and being caught flat-footed. I think storytelling is another one where we're maybe getting flat-footed. And one of the things I appreciate about this conversation is there's kind of a story-like quality to this that kind of creates hope and inspiration for the role of faith in politics and whatnot. But when it comes to the issue of abortion, do you have any insight on storytelling and the pro-life movement?
You know, I think one of the biggest things we face, and I just talked about this with a bunch of pastors, I don't know, maybe last week, is, I just heard the statistic that 1 in 4 women have had an abortion, which again, that's hard for me to understand and process. But I think going back to the church's role or the faith institution role is because I've got a bunch of, I do a lot with our Jewish friends, and they're next to us on this. And I think one of the things we've done very, very poorly is to help women who are post-abortive be free of shame and condemnation. And again, the reason I bring that up in this question is because the greatest voice for the pro-life movement is the woman who has experienced. So I had Dr. Alveda King on our little show last week. She had 2 abortions. She shared that very openly. And who better to talk about, I've heard, obviously I'm not a woman, I can't speak to these topics, but I've heard that, the devil lies to you on both sides. Like, hey, you can't possibly have a kid. You don't have the money for a kid. You don't have the time for the kid. The kid's going to ruin your life. And the moment that you have the abortion, how could you do that? Like, what are you like? And I think that this father of lies concept, and the reason I bring it up in this question is simply, I think that has unfortunately muzzled our greatest storytellers for the pro-life movement, is this idea of the heaping shame and condemnation that is coming from them, from the enemy, and from sometimes, unfortunately, our churches.
And they're going to stay in that shame when the pulpit is silent, because they're going to be told, you're not allowed to talk about this.
That's right.
Wow. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, that's it. That's that. So I think, again, I have one of our team members here in the Governor's Faith and Community Initiative office is a baby born to a mom from a rape. Okay. So his very existence is one of the great exceptions of most, including Florida. We have mother's health, rape, and incest. And so that's very common. But I think some of a lot of people are like, so I asked him, I said, hey, would you share your story? Which he has shared with me a lot. And his comment back was very telling. He said, I need to check with, and he's a 45-year-old man. I need to check with my mom to make sure she's okay with it. And again, this is where I think we have failed to put our arms around and say, hey, listen, like, this does not define you. Your past does not define you. Only one gets to define you. This is not it. And so I think that's one. I think 2, again, I go back to just a total lack of preparation. Like, I think our storytelling is coming. Now in Florida, we're not spending a bunch of time telling stories because candidly, we can talk about bad legislation, which is very, very helpful because one of the ladies that will speak with me tomorrow will say this amendment is very, very simple. All pro-lifers should vote against it, but so should pro-choicers. It's just there's no parental consent. So I think that's the answer to your question, though, is that the greatest spokespeople are the ones that we as a faith institutions have not done a very good job coming around and saying, this doesn't define you. And let me tell you how your story can be used for others. Because when they get that, right, and I know this is true with you and I too, I share openly about some things that I really walked through that were hard on many conversations for the sake of the fact that I'm like, if all it does is help me or get me through something, then my pain gets wasted. And I think that's something that we have not done a good job of. I also want to say that if I had a challenge for your entire listening audience, I would say there's 2 things that we better be thinking about. One is we better not just be against legislation. We'd better figure out how we're going to start caring for moms and babies, particularly with special needs and in low income situations, because that's the big criticism of the church, right? Is all you guys only care about, you're only pro-birth, but you're not actually pro-life. And I would say I'm super excited because in Florida, that's what 5.5 years has been about. We didn't know this amendment was coming, but for 5.5 years, we've been building robust networks for that kind of thing. The second thing I want to say to your preachers, right, the faith leaders that are listening on this call, is whether or not you were talking about the topic of life before these amendments started hitting your state, it can't stop when this, because what I've learned is the faith leader that talks about life has no problem pivoting to, oh, by the way, and because we believe that, this is bad. Right. The one that doesn't usually talk about it is the one that has the hardest time making the turn. And I just would say, I think we as Christians are crazy sometimes because we think we're going to knock something down and it's just going to go away. Like the opponents of this, or our opposition to this, is not going away. Like, we will be in Florida, if we don't vote this thing down big enough, in 2 years from now, we'll be dealing with something else. And so it's imperative, as one of my friends said in this space, he said, It's one thing to lose our politics. It's another thing to lose our pews. And it is super, super, super important that our pews are hearing the truth, that our pews are hearing scriptural messages, so that when this thing comes up, it reminds me of, Mike, you ever hear that story about they say a counterfeiter for the FBI never studies anything but the US dollar. You ever heard that? Mm-hmm. And because then they know immediately when counterfeit comes in front of them. That's the image I get of what our preachers are bringing to the table, is just there's so much truth being poured in at every level at every time that when a counterfeit comes in front, no problem. We got that thing spied out.
Yeah. Well, this is an opportunity right now for the followers of Jesus to love their neighbor as themselves. All human beings are made in the image of God. That includes our unborn neighbor. And we are to seek their good. And in the country we live, that means it's a blessing. It's actually a blessing that we can pursue the good of our neighbor through political means. And you're right, that does not just end after Amendment 4 is defeated. It carries on. And I'm grateful to hear of the work that you're doing that will carry that on. And my hope, Erik, is that the emotion that a political season stirs up and the energy that stirs up and even the financial resources that get stirred up during a time like this carry on post-election, and the church carries forward the work of loving their neighbor as themselves. Erik, it's good to meet you, man. You ever need anything, you hit me and Apologetics Inc. up. We're in the business of bringing awareness to the most important issues that exist and ultimately showing people how that which their heart desires most is found in Jesus Christ. So thanks for your time, man. I know you've got to be exhausted with everything you've got going on. So I really appreciate you carving out this time to talk to me, man.
I know people are going to listen to this at all different times, so it won't be applicable forever. But man, we as a state have just been ravaged by hurricanes. We would covet prayers across the country. Yeah. And I know everybody's facing natural disasters, but tomorrow we'll be deeply in battling another one, which again, I know time changes, but so appreciate meeting you, man. I please say hi to Aaron for me. I can tell you, I'm going to be a fan.
Well, I think Aaron's literally sticking his head in right now.
Well, it's a blurry
Aaron,
background,
is that you?
Hi, Aaron.
No.
Oh, it's not. Well, I'm still on the podcast, whoever that is.
I love it. Well, thank you so much, man. I appreciate it. And we'll get back together. We'll get back together post this thing and talk about getting more and more of the country to start using Care Portal to start serving needs.
Man, I'd love it. And hey, we are praying for you. We've got a number of staff that are in the state and in the path too. So our prayers are with you. And yeah, we're praying for you, man.
Thank you, buddy. God bless you.
All right. Thanks.